We're following the breaking news. Russia now activating a very powerful air defense missile system inside Syria in what one U.S. military official calls a major escalation. We're back with the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Republican Congressman Mac Thornberry of Texas. You got a big hearing tomorrow with the defense secretary, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That S-400 anti-missile system the Russians are putting in Latakia right now, potentially that could endanger U.S. warplanes flying over Syria, going after ISIS targets, not just Turkish or French or other planes. U.S. aircraft potentially could be endangered.
Exactly right. It has a wide range, and it can include the U.S. air base inside Turkey, as well as other aircraft that we fly in that region. So I agree with the point that it is a major escalation, and that's part of what we're going to ask the Secretary of Defense about tomorrow.
Okay. What do you want to hear from him?
I want to hear a path forward towards successfully degrading ISIS.
How do you do that?
Well, the president has said that was his goal, but at the same time, the president says, well, they're contained and we think things are going pretty well. I don't know of many folks who would agree with that assessment. So one example is we had more airstrikes in the first 2 months of Afghanistan than we have in the last 16 months of Iraq. So a more serious effort with U.S. leadership is absolutely required. The military details, the military has to decide. It's not for Congress to decide that, but we should insist, I think, on a strategy that leads to success, not a holding pattern.
Because the U.S. military is bound by certain restrictions. They don't want civilian casualties, so-called collateral damage. And if the pilots go in and they've got their bombs, but they get word that ISIS forces are in the midst of a civilian area, they're not going to drop those bombs because they don't want to kill civilians.
Exactly, and ISIS knows what our restrictions are, and they take advantage of it. And they have been terrorists.
So how do you get around that? If ISIS deliberately plants themselves in the midst of civilians, elderly, women, children in Raqqa or elsewhere in Syria, how do you get around that?
Well, the key is you've got to leave ISIS guessing. You cannot be so restrictive that we only drop ordnance on about a third of the sorties, and that's what we've been doing. So we have to remove those restrictions. It would also be helpful, by the way, if we had forward air controllers who could help target those airstrikes to be more effective. But the president has not allowed that either.
50 special operations forces are being deployed to Syria right now. That presumably is a start.
Well, 50 guys is not going to turn this struggle around. But my point is there is a series of restrictions we have placed on ourselves which shows the ISIS and shows potential allies that we're not serious, we're not committed, and we're not going to stay with this. That momentum has to be turned around to push back against
Occasionally
ISIS.
they have some pretty good intelligence. When they took out Jihadi John, the propagandist, the ISIS who was in the videos beheading Americans, among others, they knew what they were doing then.
Yeah, no question. We occasionally have successful strikes, but I think it's also telling that right after the Paris attacks, the first couple days of attacks that the French carried out were targets that the Americans had provided them. The question is, why hadn't we already been hitting those?
What's the answer to that? Why didn't the U.S. hit those targets?
Because of our restrictions, and there's really not much more of an answer.
But when you see the Defense Secretary, Ash Carter, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, tomorrow, do you have confidence that they know what they're doing right now?
I have confidence in them as individuals. What I do not have confidence in is that the White House gives them the leeway to have a successful mission. And to me, that's the key. The military has to be in charge of the military part of this campaign, and they can't have White House aides micromanaging every step that they take, which is what's been happening.
You've seen these reports that the Inspector General of the Department of Defense is investigating whether they were sugarcoating intelligence reports, the U.S. Military Central Command, to make it look a lot more rosy, the war against ISIS, than was actually the case. You're deeply concerned about that, but how serious of a problem is that?
Well, any hint that intelligence is being shaded to try to please people in the White House or other superiors is very concerning.
Was that going on?
We don't know, but we are not just relying on the Inspector General. Both the House and Senate Armed Services Committee with the House Intelligence Committee are working together on our own review of these matters, because it is a very serious issue, and we're trying not to make sure we don't interfere with the Inspector General investigation, but Congress has its own oversight responsibilities into an allegation that's that serious.
So you're going to let them do that investigation separately? You're not going to call witnesses before your committee on whether, because they're there are a lot of so-called whistleblowers who say their intelligence reports were doctored.
Well, we are discussing this with a number of individuals who have knowledge of the facts. We are trying to be careful not to interfere with the Inspector General investigation, but we're not going to wait until that's over because it is so serious and it has such relevance to what's happening today on the ground.
When the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan, issues an alert saying that a terror threat is imminent, and then they say not just imminent, but within the next 48 hours, that suggests they have hard intelligence that there's a terror plot against Americans in the works in Afghanistan. There's still 10,000 U.S. military personnel in Afghanistan, thousands of American civilians at the embassy, contractors. There are a lot of Americans there.
There are, and a lot of Americans in danger. I think it is somewhat unusual to have this much specificity on a particular warning. But you're right, they must have very specific information to issue that sort of warning, and hopefully they have enough information to stop the plot before it's carried out.
Does the Afghan military, which is supposedly in charge of protecting the U.S. Embassy and protecting Americans, protecting everyone in Afghanistan, and the U.S. has spent tens of billions of dollars training, arming, getting the Afghan military ready. Can they get the job done?
They can over time. Remember that what our military said they needed as far as continued U.S. presence were not allowed to stay because the president started withdrawing people too early. Secondly, intelligence is one of the things that takes more time to develop, an intelligence capability. So we need to stay there in order to assist them to stand on their own 2 feet. If we leave too early, like we did in Iraq, you have a result that will resemble Iraq, and obviously that has been a catastrophe for the world.
You want the 10,000 U.S. military personnel to remain in Afghanistan for how much longer?
As long as it takes. I wouldn't put a time limit on it. The question is, how quickly can you build up the Afghan capability? And the 10,000 number is a political number. It is not what the military asked for. The president just wanted to be below 10,000, so they end up at 9,800.
U.S. troops have been there in Afghanistan for 14 years already. This is the longest war in U.S. history. Are you talking about another 14 years before the Afghan military can do it on their own?
I don't know how long it will take, but you know what, Wolf? Think about what all of us expected on 9/11 as far as further attacks. So that U.S. military presence in Afghanistan has helped prevent al-Qaeda from successfully attacking our homeland again over these 14 years, at least in a big 9/11 type plot. So it's had important dividends. Now, it's absolutely true we want the Afghans to provide for their own security, and that takes some time, but we shouldn't run out because we see what's left if we do, by the example of Iraq.
Mac Thornberry is the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. Mr. Chairman, thanks for